coming in, yeah, the pause on it. Yeah, that's in the,
There is no money. It's never happened. It's not even a gold standard. It's nothing. And then the commercial value. And so.
Well, hi then, Arthur. If we could start off, could you tell me how you would describe or go into some detail about the distinction between man-made knowledge and the creation?
Very interesting. Well, there's in the language of creation is where man interacts with man, where man interacts with the flowers, the trees, and everything that we experience in creation. That interaction forms the sensations, and we then express that as sensations, as in hand and face gestures, arts and craft, and in our tongue. Those sensations become the true sounds of creation, because every image that we interact with is real, because it has substance. It's got the consciousness behind the living thing, and so we're able to express that. With the man-made knowledge, these are you won't find the ideas, you won't find them anywhere in creation. No matter where, like I use the word like Supreme Court.
Yeah.
You won't see that word anywhere in creation.
Yeah.
Where is its image?
Yeah.
And what does it do? See, with the man-made, with the language of creation, we can see everything and what it does for creation. We know what a bird does. We know what an apple does when it produces an apple, and the substance of that apple, and how we can eat that apple, and how it's all connected to the ecosystem, and how it keeps everything going. And obviously, the deeper you go in, you can the air and the water and the clouds, just everything's like that. But in the man-made, you cannot find that at all. What does the Supreme Court do?
Yeah, it's just.
Can we eat it?
Yeah.
Can we drink it?
Yeah, it doesn't have any function in the continuing thing of the world, does it? It's just if you think of it on a rough level, it's completely pointless, because all it does is perpetuate the man-made things. It doesn't add anything to nature, does it?
Nothing at all.
Yeah.
And so there's these two languages. There's this man-made language, which is what delivers a payload of constructs that have no meaning. And so the education system that we've entered into, that all of us have entered, is what brought us into comprehending these man-made constructs, which is this man-made language. And so we then, because we man are being the creator of what we're creating in our lives, we put our energy into these ideas. So, for instance, the Supreme Court, it can't walk or talk. We have to put our energy into that idea to prop it up, because it can't stand, can't do anything.
Yeah.
Now, to form the physical image of the Supreme Court, we've got to go to the living mountain and destroy it.
Yeah.
Rip out and create steel and all the artificial things that you're not going to find in creation, to prop up this dead corpse called the Supreme Court. And so then we have to maintain it. Now that means that if you look at creation, you look at families, and in the old days, we were tribes, we were villages, we were communities, where we lived in creation, where we were growing food, we were we were supporting each other, nurturing each other, caring for each other. Now we're in the modern Western world civilization of commerce, where we have the thing called the Supreme Court, we have insurance, we have banks, we have government, we have the whole system, where we have to put our energy into it, because it can't do anything for itself, which takes us away from the real world. So we can't do anything anymore. That's why most of us are getting sick, because we're not getting the real world anymore. Whether it's we're eating it, we're not eating real food, we're not eating, breathing real air.
Just getting the wrong or distorted versions of it, which is something we're going to talk about later, isn't it?
Yeah. So we can discuss. If we look at how did this happen? How is it that we are causing so much chaos in this world, propping up these dead corpses? Because all these dead corpses is what's causing all the destruction. Meaning, we're putting our energy into it.
Could you just for a second, sorry to interrupt you, but you've been using the phrase dead corpse a bit,
yes.
And I was wondering if you could just, for sake of clarity for everything, if you could just go and explain that in a little more detail.
Well, I use it as in the freedom, truth and the movement, a lot of people use the word dead corpse. Imagine a dead body. Someone's died. Now, the body can't stand up anymore, but you've got to pick it up, and you've got to make it walk, and you've got to make it do everything for it, right? So, like, for instance, a piece of paper is a dead corpse. The piece of paper, you can't do anything. You have to pick it up, you've got to write on it, you've got to move it, you've got to file it, you've got to put it into an envelope, and you've got to mail it. Someone else has got to read it. You know, and it needs
So
man to keep putting energy into it to keep propping up this dead corpse.
So it's a bit like a puppet as well. Yeah. But it's a phrase that is it's got some life to it. So it's a good descriptive thing of things that are wrong, really. Yeah,
because we're putting energy into a dead world. Then also the issue comes in, which we'll talk about fairy tales and how at some point when we discuss this, because why do we do that? Why are we putting all energy into a dead world? Because if you think about the dead world, how much of our time is occupied with dead corpses? Government.
Well, perhaps we should talk about that now. I mean, that's as good a time as any. Do you want to talk about that now, about the fairy tale?
Yeah, I'm happy. Well, very interesting subject because it embraces these two languages that we're talking about. As children, we were, I suppose...
Maybe we could talk... Would it be easy to talk about that if we talk about the boats thing, the people coming to Australia? Is that a good way into the fairy tale?
We could explain that. Like, okay, well, we could do that. Like, for example, imagine in the 1500s we have a British admiral arriving with one of his ships, rowing in with his first officers, and they're all dressed with their regalia and all that, and they're probably talking in Latin back then, or Greek, or because the English language was still not really being used at that point, and we have the man on Gondwana land noticing this ship that's arrived. Now this ship, you'll never see that information anywhere in creation on the land. You won't see that. It's just something, it's a whole new phenomenon. What is that?
Yeah.
It's like something from Mars.
Yeah.
And then this regalia and clothing and all this attire they're wearing, and then anyway he arrives. I'll use the Aussie accent because I don't know how to use I don't know how to act.
The strange Latin concept.
G'day, I'm Admiral Bligh. I represent King George III of the British Empire. And we have a thing called the Westminster system, and we have a thing called government. And look, what we've done, we've come here to conduct a census amongst your people to see whether we would like to introduce a monetary system for you, and insurance, and banking, and Medicare, etc. And the man on the land here, the indigenous man, they'll be sitting there scratching, going, "This is all gobbledygook.
Yeah.
I mean, this is all Martian. What all the sounds coming out." They don't see that. You cannot find those sounds anywhere. What bird sings that?
Yeah.
Where's the wind that tells us that sound? You won't find it anywhere in creation. So what I'm trying to point out is that shows you that distinction where we have constructed ideas that don't exist, ideas that were imagined out of thin air, that we will never find anywhere in creation, right? And they put the energy into it to have it propped up, to think that it's true and it's real, that we can offer that to the indigenous man on the land here, on Gondwana land. It's just an example. So, how did we get the man on the land of Gondwana land to comprehend what is Westminster? What is the House of Commons? What does it mean, royal family? Is
this about the two languages then? This is...
Yeah, because I mean, we're now talking a man-made language with these ideas that are part of a man-made language which you'll not find anywhere in creation. They don't exist. They're invisible. What does any of these? What does Westminster do for creation? The indigenous man, the land will be thinking, well, can we eat it?
Yeah.
Does it create air?
Yeah.
Is it something? Would we all suffer if it didn't exist?
It's a very good question. Yeah.
Would we miss out on something? So
because that's it. That's one of the things that I think it might be a good way to talk about things later. Is that when we talk about remedies and things, it's what the part of the solution is that the problem at the moment is all based on these fictions, isn't it? And we have to imagine a completely different way of living, which doesn't have the trappings of the world we have at the moment, because we won't if we give that world up, then will have to have different priorities and a different way of living, which isn't necessarily bad, it's just we're used to all the current ideas.
That's right, and we've got to be responsible in how we make these changes. Like for us with children, we just can't suddenly pull out of the fiction completely and begin to think that we can live outside the middle of nowhere, outside of the whole fiction, with children exposed to this Western world way of life. So we've got to do it fast but gradually and responsibly. So look, the thing is to do no harm. We've got to make sure that we do no harm in every step of the way in stepping out. So we Fiona and I in this work, we say we use the fiction to step out of the fiction. Now, I suppose we should discuss about the fairy tale and talk about this fairy tale, because how did we fall? Now, when I talk about the language of creation, it's the language of consciousness, all right? And the man-made language that's invented out of thin air, which is invisible, is the language of unconsciousness. And there's two distinctions here, because in the language of creation, every life form of creation takes full responsibility for creating what it's creating. Like, I'm responsible for creating the man that I'm creating. I'm responsible for what I put into my mouth, what I breathe, how I think, how I feel, and how I act. So, in taking full responsibility, or learning to take full responsibility, because I didn't know, and obviously coming out of the fiction, I wasn't responsible. I was not able to be responsible, but in creation, we are fully responsible. In the fiction, no one takes responsibility, because there's nothing conscious behind it that stands and walks and talks to take responsibility, because it's dead. Now, this shows you the brain control of what has happened to us, and how did they do this? Well, one of the ways to describe this is that imagine that we were children, and we sat on our parents' lap, or uncles and aunties, or friends, or neighbours, and there they would read us Alice in Wonderland, and read us all Harry Potter in this day. And through the gradualism of doing this on an everyday basis, we have a fairy tale which you're not going to find in the forest anywhere. Like if you brought a child into a forest and got the child, get the forest to raise the child, the forest will not tell the child the story of Alice in Wonderland, because it doesn't exist. And no matter where you go in creation, no matter up in the air or in the sea, you won't find that story. So it required someone to memorize that story. In this case, they put it into written format, into an alphabet language format, into a book, and the child could sit here, and we could have mum reading the story and looking at the pictures. And what we've got here is a third party, as in mum, or dad, whoever, telling us the story, because we cannot read alphabet languages as children, right? And we're learning to form a fictitious character in a fairy tale through a third party. So, when you imagine doing that over years, and we end up in preschool, where a third party stranger comes along to continue that kind of brain control process, we're learning to accept a fairy tale with a fictitious character, with costumes and titles, because we all act as children. We act out in the fairy tale, these characters. You know, we see them as Superman and Spider, you know, whatever, you know. And so we end up in kindergarten, then we end up in primary school, up until the age of 12, and we see the gradual introduction of adult fairy tales. Police officer, sheriff, judge, you know, and we're slowly acclimatizing to the Western world civilization, which is an idea. Doesn't have any substance to back it. It doesn't. You won't find it anywhere. But we've been conditioned through education to comprehend these ideas. You know, hence what I said about the indigenous man on the land, when Captain Bligh landed on the land, he mentions all these words. How do we get the indigenous man to comprehend these meanings of these words? So those powers that be behind the scenes, who have control of the education system, who are the ones who benefit from everybody putting their energy into the government, into the politics, and that blossom out of the education, because we all end up in courses and careers, and you know, whether we're paying taxes or we're working to borrow money and having mortgages, and you know, etc., etc. It's all part of the infrastructure of the Western world civilization. So, the education, the purpose of the education is to get us to form fictitious characters, acting in a fairy tale, and learning to accept others who are third parties in costume and titles as well in an adult fairy tale. So we end up in high school, we end up in university, which is finishing school where they really finish you off, because then you've got a certified title and degrees and whatever other labels you want to attach to it, where you are now a truly fully costumed man or woman with a title in the fiction. Now, that is how we have been introduced into a fairy tale. And then we allow the third parties, because the thing is that if you look at in creation, all men are equal. But in the fairy tale, they say all men are equal, but some more equal than others.
Yeah. The serfs and the commoners and the titled people.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. And this is very fascinating because, you know, now we have a police officer or a sheriff, from our experiences, who thinks he's of a higher standing because he believes in the statutes and the education has been provided and the support infrastructure behind it that backs it by other men and women. It's all men and women putting the energy into this because of what is a police officer? He can't stand, can't walk, can't do anything. He's a dead corpse.
Yeah.
So we have a man who's now unconscious of man. He's no longer a man. He's an unconscious man putting his energy into a dead corpse because he's in the fairy tale, acting out in the fairy tale. And so he's now higher than others. And he thinks he's got more power. Which we'll obviously go more deeply into, is collapsing, and that domino effect means that the whole thing's going to collapse because there's no substance behind it to back it, because no one has taken responsibility. Now, the police officer, we had the recent experience that pulled Fiona, who was journeying on the Creator's highways, you know, as a free woman, you know, minding her own business, doing no harm to anybody, you know, and we have this man who's in a costume coming out with flashing lights and flashing colours, and you know, and he's, you know, who comes and accosted Fiona in the car and asked her for a fictitious license and said, you know, do you have a license and all this sort of stuff, and Fiona says that I'm a free woman on the land, you know, women are equal, and he wanted her out of the car, took her out of the car and basically arrested her right there and then because he thinks he's of a higher standing. And the thing was, when you ask him the question, are you taking full responsibility for kidnapping the body of the woman that she is creating? And he's a conscious living woman creating the consciousness of the woman. Are you taking responsibility, the man, David Brown, the man behind the costume, are you taking full responsibility for the kidnap of the body of this living woman? Now, he's not going to take responsibility. Now, because then you ask him, who's taking responsibility for this action? Who's putting the energy into this? Who's responsible? And you've got to find out, if you go back to his officer in charge above him, right back to the inspector of the New South Wales Police Force, and then you're going to find out, well, he represents the New South Wales State Government, well, there's no one from the New South Wales State Government going to come forward and take responsibility, then you find he represents the Crown, and then you contact the living woman Elizabeth Windsor, acting as the woman queen. Are you responsible for the kidnap of Fiona Cristian out of this car? Who's taking responsibility? Someone's got to be accountable for this action. It just can't happen out of thin air. Are we dealing with Casper the Ghost? Is Casper the Ghost responsible? So basically, you know, and everyone knows, when you're dealing with bureaucracy and you want to ask questions, you have to contact Joe Blood's department, and you've got to go to there, and you just go round in circles, and the whole thing is because no one is accountable. No one takes responsibility. Meaning that everyone involved in those costumes and titles are unconscious because they themselves aren't being accountable for what they're doing.
Well, now I think it would be a good point maybe to talk about the conscious and the unconscious, or common law and admiralty law. If you think, I don't know if you think common law and admiralty law is a good topic we should go on to. So maybe it would be good to talk about consciousness and unconsciousness.
Yeah, well, Phil, you want to come and join in with us? Because we're good to, you know, if you'd like to show us not just, you know, because we're in this together, and we share, and without her support and vice versa, we wouldn't have gotten where we've gotten up to this point in comprehending this information. Because it is just information we're putting out there for helping others to try to awaken to what's going on. Well, to make some sense as to why things are so chaotic, to bring some meaning into it, because there is, at the moment, we've got all these experts with costumes and titles. You know, whether you're an academic or a professor, or you're some educator, or whether you're a David Icke, or whether you're some royal family representative like Prince Charles, you know, you're the politician, the governor, like what's his name, Kevin Rudd, the current leader of the Labor Party. You know, no one seems to be able to put the fire out of this chaos, of this madness. And we've got, 300,000 families that have been pulled out of their homes. We've got people being kidnapped left, right and centre. And it just goes, the air's getting more polluted, the water's getting more polluted, the multinational corporations, all fictions, are introducing more genetically modified food, all the original seed crops have been destroyed, and just utter destruction is just spreading and spreading and spreading and spreading, and there's nothing stopping it. So what we are focused on is to find the answers to these questions and apply that as a remedy to stop this from occurring and to turn the tide. So, we're not saying that we know all the answers. We don't. What we do say is that in taking full responsibility and learning to work with others, and this is what we bring in this subject of consciousness, we feel that there is a way out of this. And it's a subject that we both really enjoy talking about because it's really what our lives are all about, and to raise our children in a living world, not a dead world.
Yeah.
I want my children, we want our children to be around living people who are conscious, meaning they're not going to do harm. They're not going to introduce something that's going to do harm to the brain of the child, or to the body of the child, or the environment the child is in, because they're conscious. Meaning that only the unconscious are capable of doing harm. Now, how did this happen?
I was just going to say, as you see it now, if you don't give your children umpteen lollies and chocolates and this, you seem to be depriving your children for some reason. And it's like, I always say, but that's actually poison. You give it to the children, and if you don't do it, it's like, oh,
you're crazy.
You're mad. You don't let them watch TV. Oh, it's like yes, I'm trying to filter out some of the rubbish and try and give them a little bit more sense of what's pure and good in the world rather than the rubbish. And you're seen as a nutcase because you don't want them to eat McDonald's and ice creams and chips all day long.
Well, the insanity is that in the living world, we were meant to be co-creating. We use the word co-creation or co-creating because we're meant to be co-creating with the living substance of creation. Every living thing of creation that stands, that can back itself, even the trees with its leaves, it, from the seed to the growth of the tree, or from the seed to the flower, all that information of its creation, it wants to give it to you, give it to us. It wants to share that information to us. And that information is consciousness. It's love, it's energy, it's creation. Now, when we interact with all the living things of creation, we are expanding that information, meaning we're expanding our consciousness. And as we are responsible for creating the conscious living man that we are creating, man meaning woman, as when I use the word man, I mean women as well, with a capital M. We are each responsible for creating the conscious living man that we are creating. That backs up what Fiona's saying. We have to say no to anything that's going to do harm to our children. And what we feel so important is to bring our children to the living world and let the living creation provide all the information of its creation, which is so diverse and extraordinary, to expand the consciousness of our children. Okay? Instead of hijacking them from the cradle, putting them on a conveyor belt into factory planet Earth, which was really Western world civilization of commerce, and put them through an education where they're losing connection with that information of creation. They're introduced to the technologies, they're introduced to anything that's synthetic and artificial, anything that is, well,
and they're taught not to use their brains and work things out for themselves. They're taught, what's the question? This is the right answer. No, here's the problem. How do you think you can use your brain to work it out? See what avenues you get to until eventually you go, oh, I've got it. Without, sorry, no, don't go down that avenue because that's not going to take them to the right answer. As if they're allowed to work out for themselves, oh, that's taken me to the wrong avenue, and try another avenue. That's when they're learning to actually think and use their brains, as opposed to just being, that's the wrong answer, no, that's the right answer, which is what they get in school. And our eldest three will go to brainwashing.
And then get deprogrammed when they get home.
They're probably very confused.
Very. And that just shows you that the remedy is in the living world. I see only the conscious can provide a remedy to the conscious. If we don't create a world of consciousness, those who have fallen from the state of conscious into a state of unconscious, meaning they've learnt or they've been trained to ignore all the information from creation, right? And they're relying on man-made knowledge, which doesn't provide anything that's conscious.
And it's also all about selfishness. I mean, that's the whole thing. The world of nature is all about unselfishness because you know, the tree takes in our bad air and gives us the good air, which is good for the tree. The bees pollinate the flowers. You know, everything works for everything else and gives of itself to everything else without wanting a fee or anything. Whereas the man-made knowledge system is all about, you know, if I do this for you, you'll do this for me, and what can I get out of it, and what's it all about for me? And that's all. And that's what I see in my children all the time. It's me, me, me. I know, but I wanted it. She wanted it. That's what they're learning. They're not learning. Oh, to give and have love.
None of it really matters, does it? Really, in the greater scheme of things.
Who cares,
having a plastic banana isn't going to be isn't going to make your life better.
Well, and apparently Julie was saying that Socrates, apparently his conclusion at the end of his life was, men and women, what you need a piece of land to grow your own food, have friends around you. That's basically it.
Yeah.
That's what you need for happiness.
Yeah.
Your own space, good food and friends. And that's all you need, you know.
Yeah.
And yet we're totally caught up in everything else that we think we've got to have, that we then spend our entire lives maintaining.
Yeah.
You know, oh, the dishwasher's broken, oh, I've got to paint the roof, oh, the car's broken down. All this artificial stuff that we spend our whole life maintaining, rather than the horse in the field that pulls the cart, that feeds itself, pretty much, looks after itself, regenerates all its own cells, never needs a new motor or anything like that. You know, nature takes care of itself. You don't have to do a lot.
And that's where we are. We're part of that. See, what they did, I mean, we can have to explain, how did this happen? How did man fall from creation? How did man fall from the Garden of Eden into a state of fiction? How did this happen? Now, I mean, obviously that's another subject we need to look at some point, whether we do it today or not, I'm not sure. But when we talk about being selfishness, you know, you think of things like words like ego, you know, or mind, or individual, or person or personality. These are constructs, these are ideas that do not exist. You won't find them. I mean, if someone says, we have a mind, okay, well, let's cut ourselves open, let's find the mind. Where is this mind? Or let's cut ourselves open and find ego. Where is it? You're not going to find it. It doesn't exist because there's no substance behind it. There's nothing backing it. And you can't, ego, what would we all suffer if there was no ego? You know what I mean? Now, in the education system, what they did, they trained us to form a fictitious personality. And they formed it so that we would learn to become an individual. And in the word individual is the word divid, of divide. So we've learned to separate ourselves from each other and from creation. So in the living world of consciousness, there is no separation. I mean, we are the tree, we are the air, you know, because we're experiencing everything. We're not separate from it. But in the fiction, we've been taught to think, oh my God, I'm an individual, you know, I have a name, and I've got to protect my future. So I have to have a career. I've got to have my driver's license, and I've got to have my bank account. It's all going to be in my name. And so I'm busy working for me. I'm maintaining this fictitious ego, personality, whatever, in this world. And that's what becomes of most of us. We live our whole lives completely isolated and separated from the living world. And this is the greatest sadness of the whole thing, that all the time we spend in the fiction, we're actually destroying the living world. Because remember what I was saying before, is that to prop up an idea that doesn't exist and bring it into a physical form, we have to go to the living world and destroy it, to construct the physical form of what is now dead, and then maintain it. So if we want paper, we've got to keep destroying living trees, you know. If we want motor vehicles in steel, we have to keep destroying mountains to produce the ore and do all the refinery work to produce the vehicle. And on it goes. Whether you want skyscrapers or whether you want helicopters, it doesn't matter. It's always, look, there's only two things going on. Either we're expanding the information of creation we're part of, or we're absolutely destroying it. Nothing else is happening. There's nothing else going on. Everything else is an illusion. It's a fairy tale. It's fantasy.
I think it might be a good point to touch on something about responsibility and the idea of no sheep, no shepherd kind of thing, because your website's getting very successful at the moment. You're getting several million page views a month, and you've had people contacting you who kind of want you to do it all for you. But your idea is not to have that, and for people to become conscious and take responsibility for themselves. Yeah. So maybe if you could expand on that a little bit, that would be cool.
Do you want to answer that? Would you want to answer that?
Okay, if you don't mind.
Go.
Well, because it's the only way to go. Because I mean, the whole way the world of man-made knowledge is constructed is about taking no responsibility, and that's what it's all about. Because nowhere, even not just talking about all the bureaucrats and the police and all that, it's just most of us in our everyday lives, we're not taking responsibility for how we're living. So we continue to destroy the earth because we say, oh, I've got to have my car and I've got to have this. Even though we all know we're killing the earth by driving our cars, we still do it because we're not actually prepared to say, no, I've got to take responsibility for how I live and do it, and take responsibility for the fact that I am creating my life and nobody else is. And that's what, there's so many belief systems out there that tell us someone else is going to do it for us. Whether Jesus is going to come, whether the stars, there's going to be a new planetary alignment, and believe me, we get emails like this, there's a new alignment, you have all changed. We get the emails, you know, the Galactic Federation is going to come down and they're going to beam up the good guys. And there's lots of people who very seriously believe this. They're waiting for the Galactic Federation to come down at the opportune moment and beam them up. They've been told the points to go to. And it's somewhere, on David Icekins, you've got the shape system. It's somebody somewhere who's going to come down and make the world all right again.
Yeah, all magic wands.
It's just Scientology through the Thetans and all that kind of thing.
Exactly. And so that's okay. We don't have to worry about it. We can sit back, have another fag, have another beer, watch the telly, and pretty soon someone's going to come along, whether it's Jesus or Muhammad or whoever, and they're going to make it all right, which means that we don't have to do anything about it. Whereas really, in the meantime, we are the ones who are creating everything in our lives. We're the ones who've created the mess. We have to do it.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing. We've actually got to look around. And the other thing, it's not all about running off, oh, let's go and live and find some little paradise somewhere in a nice bit and live there. Because if you do that, what happened to the mess you left behind you over here?
It's all still there.
Basically, you've got to stop right where you are and go, okay, what have we got?
Yeah.
Now,
Big mess. Let's start. Roll up our sleeves. Get together. We've got to start.
But
And that's
listen,
the only way to
we
do
have
it.
a brain, and our brain is amazing. Now, Henry Ford created a car in 1920s out of hemp, right? Now, we have the capacity, extraordinary capacity. We can still use, if we want to still use use transport, we could use fibres. Now, what meaning is we don't destroy the creators of the fibre. We take the fruits of the labour of that, and we create.
And work out ways to do things that don't affect things.
Yes.
With all the amazing knowledge we've got, and we're resourceful beasts, so we can kind of work out ways. We've got all this stuff already as well, because we've probably got more plastic than we ever know to deal with, even if lots of it's in landfills, but could probably make some use of it.
We don't even know, we haven't even begun to broach just how incredible the remedies are by using living substance to produce the things. If we don't want to go, and this is another misnomer. They say, oh my God, back in the caveman days and the old days, we all worked like slave labour, and we don't want to go back there because it was really brutal. I mean, that's all lies.
So
What's the difference between slave labour today, anyway?
But that was the thing, isn't it? In the 60s, they were saying machines were all going to be working 2-hour days, and now everyone's working twice as hard for less with machines, and also having the threat of their jobs being taken away by machines, so they can't survive.
Plus, if you think about the fact that everyone says that we use like 10% or less than our brains, well, let's start unlocking the other 10%. And we actually know people who've got an education system worked out to start doing that, and they've used it very successfully. So, people are sometimes right and say, but on your kingdom, what's it going to be like? Is it going to be like this? Are you allowed this? And it's like, how can we know? We don't know who's going to arrive with what skills, what ideas, what inspirations, that when we all work together and put our energy into it, who knows what we can create? Let's not
limit it now.
It's going to be like this, and you've all got to be raw fooders, and you've all got to be in bed at 10 o'clock with lights out.
And you're all going to wear pink.
It's not about that. It's like, let's start unlocking the brain so we can actually use. And the fact is, this great myth that we came out of little flippy floppy creatures from the sea. It's like, well, if we developed evolutionary as our body needed to do things, how come we've got this 90% of a brain that we developed that we don't use? Why did we develop it if we don't use it? There's no logic to that at all, which suggests, the logic in that suggests we once used it, which is why it's developed, and we now no longer do. And I mean, there's a lot of drongos out there who probably use 1% of their brain, just to switch on the TV and order McDonald's. And that's the extent of their thought process for the day. Not many.
And there's no accident because it's all for these education system. Remember, with a dead corpse, whether it's a whole education system, whether it's a political party, whether it's a royal family, whether it's monarchy, whatever, it doesn't matter. Anything in the fiction, anything that the bureaucrats bring out there in the open, whether it's global warming and the carbon credits and all this stuff, they're all dead corpses in themselves, right? They can't do anything. It needs us to put our energy into it. to prop it up, right? So when you comprehend that, you realise that there's no accident to how we've ended up like this. Because we have to use our intent to keep putting that energy into it. So how did this happen? And this is what brings into the whole subject of you know, well, can we mention, I'll talk about this up to 1780.
Yeah.
Right, well, if you think about this, this is significant, it relates to this, is that up until roughly 1780, and generally speaking, 99.99% of the total global population, going back 10,000 years in recorded history, alphabet language history, they could not read or write. None of them could read or write an alphabet language, meaning that only a tiny, tiny, tiny select few could read and write an alphabet language. We're talking about 20 to 30, maybe up to 100 per 1 million. Now, they were the only ones who could record history, all history in any alphabet language, right? Because no one else could. No one else could record or read and write alphabet language. So that means that today's supposed 6.5 billion population, going back 10,000 years, had nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing. So if only a tiny, tiny select few recorded the history, and we say that, you know, and this has been brought out by wonderful men and women who've come into our lives during the first 3 years of this Love for Life campaign. One wonderful man pointed out, you know, that it was the owners of the castles, there was the royal houses, there was the high priesthoods, there was the landlords, and all the aristocrats and all their lackeys.
The people getting stuff out of it, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The ones who made the moves and organised things and.
Now remember, we're talking about a dead corpse world, and we've been trained to put our energy into it, to prop it up. And because they are behind it, they're the ones benefiting, and have always benefited. So if you think about up until roughly 1780, that, you know, all the serfs and commoners couldn't read or write any alphabet language. They couldn't talk Greek, Latin, or French, right? And the English language was known as the New World language, which was commenced around the 1200s and concluded in the 1500s, and it was created by Judeo or French Judeo-Judaic legals. They were what we would call today barristers or draftsmen of law, and these alphabet languages were designed to deliver the constructs for comprehension, so we could comprehend these ideas about the Western world civilization, right? So that we would put our energy into them. So this is why, if you look at it, this is where we've all ended up in a state of utter chaos, because we're not actually in the living world anymore. All our energy is in a dead world, propping up dead things that are benefiting only tiny, tiny few who are behind it.
You want to say why how the languages are used to deliver the construct?
How? You can explain it.
Oh, well, you can.
You explain it, which way?
Well, I'm just saying, well, what the idea of a construct is that if you go to the native tribe in an untouched, pristine island and say, hello, like we always say, I'm Captain Cook from the, what's it, Navy, I'm here to take a census and all this, it's absolute total gobbledygook. Because they've got nothing to relate, they live in creation and that's where they get their information. So there's absolutely nothing they can relate to that's Navy, a title, a census, and anything of that sort of civilization. So they've got to have a language that has the words to explain, just as in school, my eldest daughter right now is being taught all about Parliament and Government House and laws and politicians. And now, if she went and stood out in nature, she would not be able to get anything of that whatsoever. She needs someone else to sit here and use these words and explain what they mean so she can comprehend that construct of a government that we supposedly need to live under. So that's really what the languages are doing, so they can introduce all this foreign stuff that's not part of what we can glean by ourselves. Like if the child goes and stands in front of a tree and watches it for long enough, she's going to get an idea of what the tree's about. But you can't stand in front of the government and get an idea of what government's about without someone telling you what it's all about.
Well, in fact, let's add to that is that this is how they shut us down. Well, we shut ourselves down because we're the ones putting the energy into shutting ourselves down. We've just been coached, or tempted into doing it. When you go to creation and you go to a daffodil, the daffodil will give you all the information of its creation to us through our senses, right? We call them the senses of creation, which is your sight, sound, touch, taste, feel, smell. Now, the daffodil wants to tell us everything about it, right? But the man-made knowledge brainwashed into telling us what the daffodil is. So we go with the man-made knowledge to the daffodil, and we place it on the daffodil, blocking out everything the daffodil's trying to tell us. Now, when you look at all of creation like that, we've blocked out everything. So we're no longer hearing, feeling, seeing, touching, smelling the living world. We've fallen to a state of unconsciousness because we're in the man-made knowledge. And the man-made knowledge is what has us be separated.
So is this the kind of like about, you mentioned earlier, the rules of the divide?
Yes.
Is that
yes, because this is, again, this goes back to who started this. How did all this happen? And the evidence that we've found, and there's these wonderful books called The Ringing Cedars out of Russia, and what it seems to indicate, and what confirms it in our own research, is that there was a man. We're not talking about fallen angels, because that's a construct, that's just another fairy tale. It was a man just like you and I, who was a wise man priest. And he felt that there was an imperfection to the creation that we are part of. And he wanted to talk to the Creator. And he felt that the Creator wasn't talking to him. Now, in the Ringing Cedar books, they talk about 6 priests, or 7 priests, or whatever, and they're all part of this together. And this is ancient Egypt. We're going back, probably 8,000 BC to 9,000 BC. And this particular priest, the main leader of this group, because he felt that the Creator wasn't talking to him, he wanted to cause the Creator to talk to him. Now, when we talk about a Creator, remember, every dream has a Creator. The dream cannot create of itself without the Creator creating the dream. So even this creation has a Creator, this dream. And so he wanted to, like a child, like a child wanted to get the attention of the parents, the only way is to misbehave, to try and get the parents' attention. But what he would start to do is try and get attention from the Creator by starting to do something that would to get the Creator to talk to him. Because he wanted to discuss, look, you've got some imperfections in this creation you've created. We want to talk about it. So if you comprehend that this Creator created a dream so perfect that it was in such fine detail, all thought out to incredible levels of detail, that not even one stone is unturned, and everything's so perfect, that all he could do to cause some reaction of the Creator was to start to destroy it, to start to destroy the perfection. Now, to do that meant he had to start destroying himself, because all he could do. And so he did. So he had to start imagining a fantasy world. He had to start coming up with ideas that were not part of creation. Like the information that was inspiring wasn't found in anything in creation. He had to use his mind, his brain, to try to come up with ideas out of thin air. And so that's what we feel has happened. He's constructed a carbon copy image of creation. He created like a shadow world of the real thing. And he wanted to have all glory be brought upon himself because it was his idea. I own it. Now, when we are conscious, like for instance, when we breathe in or we have a drink or we have a meal, if we do not let go, we're also going to die. We will fall. Now, what he's done, he's taken on information and held it for himself and said, I own it, it's for me. Now, a conscious man, he lives, or she lives, for creation. Everything I do is for you, and for you, and for everyone. I live for the benefit of everybody else. And if everyone lives for the benefit of everybody else, we're creating an extraordinary world where we all benefit from the wonderful fruits of labour of everyone's creation, given freely, no conditions attached. So, he went against that. He went into an unconscious state which says, well, this is mine. I own it. It's my idea. So everything is now focused on him. And he had to try to get others to put his attention on him. So I think what happened back in those days was he started singing songs.
Yeah.
And these songs were not heard. These sounds were never found in creation anywhere. And that evolved into the alphabet languages eventually. And I think, I mean, without going on, I'm skirmishing the surface here. I think what's happened here, he created the rules of the divide, which is the first thing he came up with probably was geometry, which we now call sacred geometry, the compass and the square, and the circle. And then out of that came mathematics. And out of that came the alphabet languages, and they're all connected. Now, all he has done, he's removed the consciousness out of creation by forming an idea that no longer has any consciousness within it, in its embodiment. And he called it a compass.
Yeah.
Or he called it a square. Now, what does a compass do for creation that aids creation while on here now? Can we use the compass to expand our consciousness? You can't. It's impossible. There's just nothing there.
It's kind of like the idea of watches being invented by the Swiss as a con trick because everyone can really tell the time anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, there is no time.
Yeah.
No one can ever find time. It's just a construct. So, what he did to try to cause the creative talk to him, he had to try to. Well, I mean, how he rationalised this out. And back then, we were probably using a hell of maybe up to 80, 90, whatever percent of our brain. Maybe using 100% of brain. And it appears that man was living a lot longer than 100 years back then. He could have been living many hundreds of years. And so the version of reality in creation back then is probably far beyond anything we could comprehend today. Because we've just fallen so far into fiction, we don't even know what reality is anymore. The real reality of creation. So, I mean, I'm just touching on what we sense has happened. We're not saying this is exactly how it happened, but something like this is what caused this to happen. He wanted to take all power to himself and have everyone start to revere his ideas and put and train them, con them into putting the energy into his ideas to benefit him. Meaning, let's turn away from the creator of this creation and start turning on to me. Which is why we use the word Satan. Not that we're into Christianity or following the Bible, we just call him because we don't know what his name was. So we call him Satan as a man who fell from creation in a state of unconsciousness where he's removed the consciousness out of all these ideas that he was imagining, and the only one who could benefit from it was himself. Because no one else, it was not a gift of love that he was creating to benefit a community or his tribe, wherever he was part of. It was only going to benefit him. So I think that's what I think has evolved into all the seeds of what became the ancient Egyptian Western world civilization of commerce. I mean, he had to duplicate what creation was doing in such a way that he could have the power for himself. So he came up with the idea of commerce. So our acts of love in creation that I release to benefit you. Now we're not talking about trade and barter. If I've helped in my garden to produce excessive amount of apples, and my family don't need the other 9 boxes. Well, I give it to my community to benefit, and because I've given my 9 boxes of apple doesn't mean that the community's got to give me back 9 boxes of pears. It's just an act of love. It's just simply I've released because that's who I am. So that's an energy. It's creating substance, and then like what Fiona said before about the tree creates the carbon dioxide, or that creates the oxygen, and then we create the carbon dioxide, and man needs the tree, and the tree needs man. You'll find in everything of creation, everything's so entwined, interlocking, and we're all in this together. We're all part of this living consciousness. Well, he's removed himself out of that, and so he created commerce. Where all roads lead to him instead of the road leads to him. And so he's unfolded systems to get man to worship false idols of his system. So this is where the pyramids came out. This is where the obelisks. This is where all the beginnings of the false idols of Pharaoh and the ancient mystery schools and all the secret societies have blossomed out of it, because he had to do everything that did not have consciousness embodied in it. Because otherwise, if he was doing it with consciousness, then he would be doing everything as acts of love, and there would be no need to cause the creator to talk to him, or he thought the creator. So in here, deluded state, he did this. And so we're now living with the residues of that action, and he trained his son.
Of 2,000 years of it all building up, basically. More, 3,000
years.
Well,
we're going back to 8,000 BC now. This is 10,000 years ago when all this started. Because the oldest man-made alphabet language is ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. The Masons today, in the Freemasonic world of today, that Freemasonic world is the organisation of the infrastructure of the Western world civilization of commerce.
Just going back and back and back.
Going back and back and back.
Because as his civilization spread, obviously he needed others to
keep perpetuating
and
the
to
concept.
spread it. To keep going.
And putting the energy in it to prop it up because it's a dead corpse, right? So, and it would have adapted. So, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics became Sumerian hieroglyphics, it became Phoenician hieroglyphics.
It's about progress, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, whether you can call it progress.
It's not progress.
Anti-progress.
Yeah.
All eyes wear thin. So, because the whole idea is to form temptations to get man to be tricked into thinking, oh God, this is something new. Because back then, when he started singing these songs and started coming up with these ideas to try to get the Creator to talk to him, there was no reference points or boundaries to the idea of unconsciousness. It was unheard of. The act of doing what he did was that he was the one that created darkness. Now remember, we're taught today that we have this thing called duality. But there is no duality. Like if you look at the sun casts no shadow. Where do you ever see the shadow cast by the sun? Well, if you look at a clear night sky, you can see everything. There's no darkness. If there was darkness, it would be a jet black wall, and the sun would be casting a shadow, and there would be light and darkness together as duality. Now, what I'm saying is light is creation and darkness is destruction. It can only be one or the other. So why would someone create and destroy at the same time? So there cannot be duality. It's impossible. Why would we create a child and kill the child at the same time? So the myth of duality doesn't exist. There is no such thing. All that exists is just creation and the aspects of creation. So if you take that through into everything he was doing, and apologies, I'm losing my train of thought because this subject takes us so many places with this subject.
I'm sorry,
It's okay.
reach over and grab that. It's going to be really loud.
The ideas he was constructing out of thin air, where he would con man to put the energy into his ideas instead of getting man to put his energy into creation. Right? Like if we go back over this a little bit here, if we bring our children up in the living world, where our children are interacting with the living world all the time, and the living world of creation, of consciousness, all that information is expanding the consciousness of our children know and remember who they really are. But in the dead world, they cannot remember who they are because they're now imitating all the fictitious man-made knowledge, and which means that there's a huge fall in consciousness. Well, they're no longer a man. They're now what we call a human, H-U-man, meaning hue meaning a man of colour or colour of money. No, it's a man of colour, of many colours. Hue also means air. It means also nothingness. So we use the word human as a man unconscious of consciousness. That's what a human is. We're not a human. We're man. We're consciousness. And trying to go back to this extraordinary subject. I just it's a subject that we invite a lot of discussion to look more into this, because to help us to find the meanings to how we're causing so much chaos in our world today, and not be able to put a finger on the pulse and stop this. Meaning, just take responsibility.
Yeah, because
it's basically selfishness. We have been trained from such a young age to just basically be selfish, and that's what it is. It's our selfishness that means we want to hang on to all our possessions, and we want to keep doing all the destructive behaviours because we think they're fun and we like them. But it's like, well, too bad actually.
Tough luck.
If you want a future in the world for your children and grandchildren, you're going to have to stop being so selfish, and you're going to have to give up some of those things that you really enjoy. But hey, there may be something more out there if you give your brain a chance to actually develop and work it out. And what better how exciting is it to live in a time when we've got an opportunity to change it all around and turn it around? Well, let's all put our brains on that rather than on the footy score. It's like,
because the main part of what you're doing is really do no harm, isn't it? That's the basis of it all, really.
It's just do no harm.
Just kind of a way of rearrangement that's based around that.
And it's a very easy little thing to look at your life and go, okay, where are the areas that I'm doing harm? And okay, most of us can find a zillion areas of our lives that we're doing harm. But it's just starting to be aware of those and going, oh, maybe I could do that little thing a little bit differently, even if it's like giving up a cigarette because that's doing yourself harm. Or,
tell me about it.
Or I'm Peter. Or whatever it is that you can, whether you can go to work with someone in a car rather than using both cars.
Just
do the harm,
gradually get there.
everything.
Tiny steps.
Let's rewind. Going back to the priest about this.
Yeah.
All he could do was to create distortions.
Because I wanted to ask you about the distortion. Because you were talking about distortion earlier.
And that's what the alphabet language is. All
Yeah.
alphabet languages are distortions because the information being provided is not found anywhere. So, and all the distortions are the destruction to the living fabric of creation. Right? So this is why we now have Monsanto, and we have all these genetically modified, private corporations, because the men and women putting the energy, because they're all fallen, they're no longer conscious men, they're all humans. They're putting the energy into this thing called Monsanto, and then you've got the judges and the law and the politicians backing it, because and then you've got the Freemasonic war behind that, pushing it, because it can't happen without all that energy to prop it up, to keep that happening, to distort everything of the living world.
And then we end up eating distortions.
And how totally insane is it for them to pretend that they care, like the governments and all that, that they care about us? Now, if they cared about us, would they be producing genetically modified food? Would they be making it so farmers can't even collect their seed to grow their next
and not
year's
testing
crops?
it and not
I mean, they're guaranteeing starvation to the poor farmers of the world, and yet they're supposed to care about us.
Yeah, and all the chemtrails coming out of the aeroplanes with all the incredible, highly dangerous chemicals and heavy metals, like barium, just soaking, floating down, and they know they're intentionally doing this. They can't sit there and act like they're not aware of it, and they all know they're doing
But
it.
the thing,
Fluoride in the water, the MSG, the vaccinations. These are what the vaccinations are distortion. The only reason why our body has gotten sick is because we're eating distortion. We're thinking distorted thoughts. When we bring our children up in the living world, we get the perfection of creation that brings all the sensations out of us, right? We eat everything in a pure, sincere state, because our thinking and our feelings are pure and sincere. But in a distorted state, we're no longer pure and sincere. We're impure and insincere in our actions, in every way imaginable. And that reflects in the destruction, because no one's taking responsibility.
Because the terrible thing about all the things, the corporations and Monsanto and politicians and things, is so few people benefit from it, because it's all based on like backhanders and greasing the wheel and this kind of thing, isn't it? But so few people actually, like, it's only like 5 or 10 people who are getting the big houses and the checks from Monsanto and all that kind of thing. It's all
well, that's the whole of the Western world civilization of commerce. It is all about the very, very few getting all the benefits.
Because they're the
everyone
copyright
else
holders.
just has to slave away to keep it going for them. And
maybe
that's
this would be a good time then for you to talk about, because you wanted to talk about copyright and the gold standard. So maybe this is a good.
Well, the priest who started, as we call him, Satan. This priest, this man, he copyrighted, or the right of copy, the ideas he was imagining out of thin air. These are all the distortions he was coming up with. And because he claimed it as mine, he wouldn't let go. He wasn't creating conscious acts of love to benefit everyone else around him and benefit creation. So he had to create everything in the image of his distortion. Now, he, in owning it, today we call it copyright. I own this intellectual proprietary knowledge. These are ideas that I claim as mine. And what I have had to do was I've had to educate others to comprehend these ideas and get them to use these ideas so they become renters. And in renting these ideas, I have an interest in them renting it, so I will charge them an interest for renting my ideas. So this is why we call it royalties, because the copyright holder receives royalties, hence the royal family, the crown, because the crown receives the royalties of the serfs and commoners, because they're all brainwashed into the man-made alphabet language where all the constructs have been formed out of, which we've been trained to comprehend. So we have become a man who's fallen into government. We've fallen into common law. And common law is a fiction as well. But the real common law is another subject. But then you've got man fallen into insurance, and fallen into commerce and money and banking. Look, and everything else that absolutely saturates our waking time and keeps us so distracted in a distorted state, so we're not capable of being being with creation and part of the perfection of creation. So the crown, which is known throughout the Freedom Truth networks, people say, oh, it's Elizabeth, Windsor, acting as the woman, the queen. And they say, others in the Freedom Truth network say, well, the Crown is another private corporation with a director and with a whole lot of, things he can do, you know.
Because one thing is that the government and stuff exists because it was one of the kings in England got a bit bored of actually being involved, didn't he? And he just wanted to mess about all the time. So he installed a government that kind of, or that structure that actually created the idea of government to separate it from the crown. And so it's probably, if there is something, then it's probably more involved than it being about the Queen as her being,
Well, the great difficulty here is to keep remembering and keep reminding ourselves that they wrote all the history. These tiny few people, they recorded everything because no one else could do it. So, you know, the common story is, you know, the victors always write their history. It suits the buyer's point of view, right? Now, you know, if you think of the serfs and commoners up until 1780, they couldn't speak Latin, Greek, or French, you know, generally speaking. And you know, when the serfs and commoners were dragged off to war by their landlords and the aristocrats that were under their standing, they and there they were standing with their generals looking over the battlefields, and the generals were talking to each other in Latin or Greek or French. The commoners couldn't comprehend it because they had their village talk. All the commoners and serfs and the renters, they had their own village talks. And so there's a huge thing, a big misnomer here that all the old history. Should we shut those doors? Maybe we should keep.
I'll get them on to do it.
Yeah. So anyway, the long story cut short here is that to reflect on what they did that's brought about the circumstances of today is that how to describe it, maybe look at it another way, is that they have constructed a world that suits the tiny few, them, and not the serfs and commoners. Regardless how they brought it about, the fact is their intent was that. They intended that to be that.
To alienate and to keep control. That's what it's about, isn't it?
If you remember before I talked about how the police officer, you know, he's on a higher standing. See, in the alphabet languages, when the serfs and commoners were finally forced to learn English, and English was started in the 1200s, culminated in the 1500s. Like the letter J didn't even exist till English was released, and the word Jew didn't even come out until the 1500s. So the word Jesus didn't even exist, and it appears that Jesus came out of Lysis, which came out of Isis, which came out of ISIS.
Wow.
Right? I mean, these are just. I mean, you know, there's like Jesus as Zeus. Now, there's a phenomenal history in the alphabet languages, because these like you look at the British royal family, the Portuguese royal family, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish. They all are the same, come from the same bloodlines. They're all the same houses. And I suspect what had happened as part of the distortion, so we cannot remember who we really are and try to distort all the history, so we can't seem to dot the I's and cross the T's of this, you know, of this insane world that we're in. Is that you know, one of the theories I have, it's just a theory, I feel it as maybe true, I haven't got evidence to prove it, is that the British and the Portuguese and the Dutch battleships, their armadas, they travelled to the new lands, probably doing reconnaissance from the 12, 13, 1400s, around that period of time, when they brought out Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights a bit later on, all these things that came out. And then they sent in their battleships, their men of war, and onto land like on one land around the 1500s. And like through the indigenous folklore, those the history has been passed down through word of mouth through the indigenous man. They're saying that up to 40 million of their people were murdered here on this land. Prior to the bullshit story of Captain Cook and Philip and the colonisation of the land that's known as Gondwalan land, which is now the private corporation, the Commonwealth of Australia. But I suspect what has happened, if you look at all the Americas was colonised by the British Empire. They conquered all of the Americas. Whether it's the Dutch, the Portuguese, Spanish, they're all the same houses. They're all connected, same family. They spread the Western world civilization of commerce, because that's what they're spreading. They're spreading their commercial enterprise, which comes with the government and the insurance and the banking and their whole world, of which is a dead corpse. It's just a complete dead corpse. You know, again, this priest imagined this. You know, he had to duplicate creation. This is the best he could come up with, because he couldn't use creation to do what he wanted to get created to talk to him. So he's constructed a dead world. So I suspect what's happened, they came in and caused genocide. And then they created all the fictitious wars, and so the Spanish were fighting the British, and the British were fighting the French, and the French were fighting the Spanish.
Because the people are essentially expendable, aren't they?
Yeah, and so they murdered all the soldiers who were involved in all the genocide campaigns, so they wouldn't go back and pass on the memories to their own tribes and villages and cut it all off. And that sort of tact is still applying now. You can see how they've done it with 9/11. How they altered the story. They tried to change the stories over time, so that people cannot actually get back to actually find out who's responsible, who did, and how they did it, and not dot the I's and cross the T's and make the whole thing,
Well, Islam would still be part of, because that's all part of the same monotheistic kind of religions that were all born in the Middle East, isn't it?
Yeah,
Which is the same as Christianity.
One thing that David Icke also points out, I remember, he thinks that if you look at all the religions, they've all basically got this, Virgin Mother, Son of God, all this sort of stuff. They're all based on the same story. They just put different colours on it to catch different people.
All the great freedom truthers that came along, those who stood up for freedom, their stories have been altered and changed to suit the agenda, because only those who could read and write were the ones who recorded the history. So they wrote the history so it would continue their agenda. And it's all because you'll find it's always connected to commercial enterprise in some form or another, or it's or even religion. I mean, if you think of religion, remember again we're rehashing the point. This priest Satan, this man from ancient Egypt, it was all about putting our energy, getting all of man to put their energy into his fictitious world, to prop up his fictitious world, which would prop up their fictitious constructs, like Pharaoh and the royal family of Pharaoh and the high priesthoods and the rule of law. And that's the common denominator you'll find that comes out of ancient Egypt. It travelled all over the world. It was found in ancient China. They had the royal family, the high priesthoods, and the rule of law. You find it with the Incas, the Mayans, and the Aztecs. You'll find in the remains in the Sanskrit cultures of what's now known as India, and whatever's of the Gittas. You'll see all the remnants of the rule of law, the high priesthoods, and the royal families. It's all ancient Egypt, because ancient Egypt travelled. And travelled to spread what was their first attempt at the New World Order. The idea of owning the earth, to get the Creator to talk to him. This is insanity. This whole thing. And now we call it the Second Coming, which is now this Western world civilization. Why? Why is because probably if you treat your body poorly, if you eat distorted food, your body becomes distorted. If you think distortedly, if you have impure and sincere feelings, you're creating a lot of distraction to the consciousness of the man we're supposed to be creating. We're now creating an unconscious man. The body being so distorted, the body tries to do what it does to heal, and so it creates a fever. The fever starts to cause vomit, which is the 3 to 4,000 foot tidal waves. The body starts to shake, so we end up with the earthquakes. The body starts to, even with the farting, that's the 300 plus mile per hour winds, then the diarrhea, which is the lava and the volcanoes, and so the whole of Earth, because the man and Earth are not separated, it goes into a catharsis to heal this distortion, because it's got to return to perfection to continue being what it is. So I suspect that they attempted all this and it was completely destroyed, and the insanity this has continued, and the same bloodlines who have maintained the alphabet language history, because they recorded all the history. Another thing that's very significant about this is because the tree provides all the information of its creation, and in its seeds it passes on its information to the saplings that grow and to the trees, and all, when we create our children, I pass on all that information of the man that I'm creating to my children, and we're all doing that. Here's something very significant. All of man that ever was and all of man that ever will be is all of man that we are today, because all the information of man is all the information of man now. If man does not exist here and now to think and feel all that information, who is there to think and feel all that information now? Meaning, how can creation exist if man does not exist here and now to think and feel creation?
I see what you mean.
Even more significant, if man does not exist here and now to think and feel of the past or the future, who is there to think and feel of the past or the future? So the past or future cannot exist without us existing here and now to think and feel that information. So all the information of everything that ever was and will be exists here and now, because man has to exist to think and feel it. And because we have the power to think, where all other creatures don't, we have the ability to embrace all of creation. So,
lunch break, don't you think?
Okay, that's
And
cool.
there is